So, Kev, that was a great interview with Ed, but we want to move on and circle back to when we had Nancy Davis from Quadratic with her IVOL product on a couple weeks back. And we wanted to really kind of take a deeper dive into this now that you don't have the pressure of the founder on
Breathing down our neck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that way no one can correct you if you're wrong.
That's right. So we're both big fans of the IVOL product, and we were trying to let Nancy have her tell her story. But one of the things that I'd like to do is dig a little deeper into it and understand where it might not suit somebody like me. I know you're a big bond bull and you have no problem with the entire product, but I have kind of some not issues, but I have some concerns that over the long run, owning tips might not be a good
right.
kind of a part of the exposure. But anyways, let's dig into it. Let's talk about it a little bit, and let's go through it. So here we have the actual holdings of the IVOL product.
Right.
And as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we noticed that 87% of the product is actually the Schwab ETF for the tips kind of
86.29 to be specific, sir.
Right.
No.
So, what you need to realize is that a good part of the IVOL will simply replicate the SCHP. And let's pull up the chart of that.
Yeah, sure. And so that right there is just the here's the chart right here. And so
you'll notice that this is actually rallied quite hard along with the entire bond market.
Yeah.
And my concern lies in the fact that if we get an increase in inflation, we could see a scenario where the bond market backs up and this part of the portfolio actually declines. Now, Patrick, I know you have the opinion that inflation is never coming.
Oh, yeah. Putting words in my mouth. Okay. One day it'll come. I just think you're way too early. But anyway.
Anyway, so I just want the first thing we kind of I'd like to talk about is the fact that one of the suggestions that I have that is, if you're looking at this product and you're thinking that, hey, that those steepener options, which is, let's go back to the holdings.
Yeah.
We talked about the 87% is the tips, but there's that other 13%, which is basically the long yield curve steepening options.
Right.
If you want to get exposure to solely that part, which is what I am so kind of attracted to, because those are products that you can't trade on a listed market.
All right.
Those are institutional products that you need to have an ISDAs. Yeah. And so, and not only that, you have the great team at Quadratic actually managing that and making sure that you're always long a certain amount of gamma, and they're actively trading and kind of taking care of that side of it for you. So to me, that's really the most attractive part of this product, is that 13% of those yield curve steepening options. They're cheap and they're unavailable through regular listed means.
Right.
So for me, what I like to do is I kind of look at this and I say, okay, I can buy
you right there in the picture.
Yeah, that's me and the orangutan. I can look at this and I can buy 100 cents of that product and hedge out the 87 cents of that ETF, because the Schwab ETF, because it's a listed product. And what I will be left with is basically the stub of the portfolio of the options that the Quadratic team trades. Now, and to me, that is just like awesome, and that's what I want exposure to.
Now, are you actually just going to take a certain amount of the futures, or are you going to just literally short the ETF?
So for me personally, I'm going to take it one step further, in that if you think about what is in that portfolio, it is a Schwab ETF on tips.
Right.
And you think back to what I actually want exposure to is two things. I want inflation break-evens, and I want curve steepening. So this obviously gives us one
bond volatility, right?
Yeah. So there is it's actually volatility on the curve, but that's it's long volatility, because she's managing this not by just going out and getting long the yield curve spread. She's actually buying options on that yield curve spread.
Right.
So going back to my thing, my two trades that I want long inflation break-evens, and I want long the steepener. So the steepener is taken care of, but the inflation break-evens aren't taken care of. So one of the ways I can make the inflation break-evens, instead of buying a specific tip and actually going out and shorting treasuries or treasury futures against it, I can buy the IVOL, figure out the amount of embedded tips in there, and then go calculate the duration on that and short the equivalent amount of futures.
Right. And I
so
think
that is actually how I'm playing it.
What, like 7.5 years or something on these tips?
So that's actually how I'm playing it. I'm going long IVOL versus short treasury note futures.
Right. And so someone as a retail investor that wanted to put on the same trade just could go, obviously you have to carry the margin, but you'd have to go short the Schwab ETF itself.
Or they could, if they wanted to do the same thing, they could do IEF, which would in essence be the 7-year treasury, and then they would have the same trade as me, which it would be long inflation break-evens. But if you look, the correlation here, I'll just put the IEF up against the SCHP, and you can see here the IEF's actually been quite more volatile. Because that's because we had a situation where inflation break-evens are moving all around.
Right, but all I'm saying though is that shorting the actual SCHP will give you more accurate, because that's actually what you're holding, as opposed to if you short the IEF, you're going to have some tracking error, right?
Well, no, because at that point you will be long break-evens. If you wanted to only, if you didn't want my break-even trade, then yes, you could just go short the SCHP, and you would in essence be just long the option portfolio, right? Which would be in essence,
which is still trade. If somebody just wants to put on the pure steepener and not deal with break evens at all, you would just do that way. Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you believe, and this is, I don't want to put words in Nancy's mouth, but I suspect that at her heart she's a little bit of a bond bull like you, and thinks that the Fed is going to be lowering rates, and doesn't see that much to worry about in the U.S. bond market. And if you believe that, then and you believe as well that the curve is going to steepen, and maybe also at the same time create some inflation, then you might find that this is actually the perfect instrument for you.
Yeah.
Because in that environment, you have tips outperforming, which is what you're going to be long. Right. You also have a curve steepening. And so it ends up being that you don't want any hedge. You just want to own the thing outright.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I think that's a great thought process, right? Like, first of all, when you're a proper bond bull, there's nothing wrong with just buying the IVOL product outright, right? Like,
yeah, that's exactly.
And then what you could do is you can put different derivative hedges to one manner or another associated with it to protect the bond component, while you have the optionality of all these steepener options inside there, right?
Right, and you in essence are getting exposure to an institutional level product and an institutional level manager that usually retailers can't do. It's a great product.
Love it.
Huge fan.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. So let's jump into tales from the trading desk, and we're digging one up from one of your past pieces.
Posts.
Right?
Yeah, my posts. So it's actually damn, I wish I traded that. And it's I used to have this series that I would write, and it was actually inspired from a musician that was a disc jockey on a Toronto radio station, and he would have a story where he would tell a story, mention a song and tell the story of the song, and then he'd finish it with, damn, I wish I wrote that. So I made damn, I wish I traded that. And let's go back to 1987. Yeah. And everyone knows George Soros now, but back then he was hardly somebody that the average Joe would know about. It was only he was an elite trader that basically unknown except to the few that traded with the hedge funds. But he still traded in size. And one of the things was, as 87 rolled around, he became convinced that there was going to be a crash in the stock market. The trouble is that he thought the crash was going to emanate out of Japan. Wow. And so he went out and he put on a monster short Nikkei, long S&P futures position. So think about that. In 87, he straps that on, and everything's
the
looking.
Nikkei didn't really blow out until in '89.
89. Right? You're absolutely right. So if you look at it, the Nikkei outperformed the S&P huge. But the interesting part about it was when the 87 crash came along, you can see, we'll pull up this chart of the 5-minute chart. You can see how violent the move was. Most people think about it and they think, oh, it wasn't that bad. But you'll see that the Friday, the contract was down 5%. And I remember reading stories of people saying that they were celebrating because they thought that the long-awaited correction was over. And then come Monday morning, it gapped down. And at that point, it was looking a little scary.
Right.
But the real pain was still to come. So Friday, it had started the day at 300. It closed at 280. This is the S&P 500. On Monday, it gaps down to 270 and then closes the day at 200.
Wow.
Think about that. So that's like a monster.
So just add zeros on that to put in today's perspective. 2,700 down to 2,000.
You're absolutely right.
Right. Like
you're absolutely right because
like it would be like the equivalent of a 700-point S&P crash in one day. One day.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And then what happened was it bounced and it gapped higher and then made another new low. But then it finished kind of unchanged. Wednesday, things improved. It gapped higher, it closed, it grinded its way back up. And it opened on Wednesday, it was at 260. And this is where the story of George Soros comes into play. Because on that Thursday, he's having trouble making margin calls.
He's a high roller.
He's a high roller. Because don't forget as well that back then,
Paul Tudor Jones style, right?
No, but they were 5-day settlement.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm going to read you a little bit of this book that I love. I found this book when I was a teenager. It's called Black Monday by Tim Metz, and I just love it. Anyways, it was one of the stories that he's told in there. It was from a Chicago trader that had a ringside seat for the S&P pit. Right. Anyway, so he says, I'm just going to kind of paraphrase a few bunch here. It's October 22nd, 1987. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange floored 9:30 a.m. So he says, the word is spread everywhere at the CME this morning that Shearson, Lehman Brothers, plans to sell thousands of cars on today's opening. They call them cars at the CME, but it's really, those are contracts, okay? Scott Surfling, which is basically the author or the trader in the author's story, almost stayed too long in his upstairs office and needed to run down to the elevator to make the trading desk on time. But he is here now, and today's opening will be burned in his memory. Shearson's floor broker offered 6,000 cars on the opening. Nobody would say anything. Finally, he got a bid of 198, down 60 points from Wednesday's close, and he took it. Then he sold 8,000 more cars in the first minute of trading. It had cost them $300 million to do that. And then in another minute and a half, the price was back up to 230. Okay. Wow. Apparently, it became known in the pit that there was a large customer order to sell several thousand contracts. And given the uncertainty in the market, many of the locals backed away. However, beginning suddenly at 9:30, the futures began to rally sharply, reaching the 230 level within 3 minutes. Approximately 2 hours later, the S&P 500 futures were back above 250. It was an instant 24% decline, followed by a 28% rally in 2 hours. Goldman Sachs bought some of the contracts at the opening. Bob Rubin, the firm's top trading official, will confirm. So did Shearson, acting for its own account, another official will confirm. I was mad as hell when I found out it was one of our own customer sales, he would add. The seller was high-stakes Wall Street investor George Soros. You ought to talk to George about that trade if you'll talk to you, Rubin suggested. But attempts to reach Soros will be unavailing. The incredible bust will be a miracle that changes the life of one of Sterling's colleagues, who on Wednesday mistakenly neglected to close out a short position of 25 cars. The mistake could have been a disaster if the market had opened sharply higher. Instead, the price break caused by Shearson's selling will let him buy the 25 contracts he needs at less than 200, giving him a profit of 700 to 800 grand. I only knew him by the badge number, and he wouldn't talk about it. He just walked out of the pit, sold his seat, and he hasn't been seen back on the floor since that day.
Thank you, George Soros, right?
Yeah.
We talk about him and his famous, breaking the Bank of England, but you know what? It comes around, goes around. A big trader can take a hit just as easily as he can walk away with $1 billion, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. And it's just it's a really interesting story. And there's like a lot of people, if you talk to them, if they were at the S&P pit at that time, that is a very famous kind of opening. And it was probably one of the most dramatic and mispriced openings in the history of the S&P 500.
Right.
And Soros had his face ripped off.
Ripped off is an understatement.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing that, Kev.